DEI claims to be liberatory, but it functions as a normative, coercive ideology that pushes values while denying they are values. We need more diversity. Well, what they usually mean is we want people who think just like us, but who have different colored skin, different genitalia, or different pronouns. And that's diverse. That's not diverse. So the fix for this limited view of diversity is to include ideological, experiential, and cognitive diversity. That's diversity too. DEI matters in the sense because in today's world, we're kind of forgetting to love each other. It sounds a little hokey. But where does your care stop? Who's outside of the box of someone that you give a shit about? I would encourage you to look real hard at where that is for you. Welcome everybody to The Integral Edge. My name is Keith Martin Smith, and I am the author most recently of When the Buddha Needs Therapy. I'm also a leadership coach and a book coach. And you can always find more about me at keithmartinsmith.com. And so today we are here to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's pretty crazy how much things have changed. I gave a talk under the Biden administration on the 7 deadly sins of DEI a year and a half ago, something like that. And the climate was so different. I was kind of shaking in my boots at that talk, and I had some friends reflect back to me that like, you really looked nervous, and I was nervous. The political climate just 18 months ago, DEI had been ascendant, and there was a lot of power that was associated around it, and it was risky to take it head on the way that I did. And here we are 18 months later, and it's like it has shifted 180 degrees. Trump is going after DEI. Companies are dropping it left and right. It's a dizzying shift, right? I'm not nervous at all to give this talk this time because the political winds have shifted so much. And so I'm in this sort of awkward position of I'm sort of talking now about how DEI can survive when 18 months ago I was really talking about a lot of its problems. And I'm going to talk about a lot of its problems here as well. The name of this talk is How Can DEI Survive, and Should It? And the idea with this talk is that I really want to go through the history of DEI briefly, talk about places where it really has some serious structural problems with it, talk about the solutions, and then give a developmental overview. So we're going to go through the history of DEI. I'm going to give a brief overview of the 7 deadly sins of DEI and their fixes, because it's easy to criticize. I'm going to give an overview of DEI's biggest problems from a meta-analysis. And then most importantly, I'm going to say why we should keep DEI, even if you're skeptical. So, as always, my hope is that this will piss you off on some level, no matter what your political leanings are. I feel like I've done my job if I'm able to really transcend politics and partisanship and binary thinking. So let's kick it off. Okay, so first we start off with a history of DEI. So diversity, equity, and inclusion in the United States. Okay, so I apologize, I don't know the history of it in Europe. I do know the history of it here since I was born and raised here. So in the US, DEI as we sort of know it today really started in the 60s and really flourished through the 1980s. And the idea there was that the root concern was historical injustice and systemic exclusion. So concrete systemic, I've said that wrong. I do it every time. The words are so close. Systematic. The root concern is historical injustice and systematic exclusion, systematic exclusion. This is concrete. So this is like whites only in diners, whites only drinking fountains, whites only at universities, redlining, the denial of GI benefits to Black Americans, stuff like women had to wear skirts at universities, and women were required to get a man's signature into the 1970s to open a bank account or to rent an apartment. Can you imagine? It's like terrible. But what made this interesting was that it's concrete, systematic racism. So what that means is that it has nothing to do with internal beliefs. It's about external realities. So you can look out into the world and you can see the evidence of racism all over the place. And you don't have to look in interiors at all, right? It's really obvious. So the response to this was affirmative action policies that were aimed at leveling the playing field. The moral justification for affirmative action, 60s through 80s, was fairness. We need to be more fair. And it was acknowledged that women and minorities were entering late into a system that had been designed to exclude them. So the key point here was that affirmative action was framed as a temporary correction, not an ideology beyond fairness. Right? So it wasn't tied to a complex philosophy. The idea here was that we can't pretend the race was fair if some people started a mile behind the starting line. The race isn't fair if some people started a mile behind the starting line. That was the sort of moral justification for affirmative action. And most importantly, I was born in late 72, and I remember that there were really a lot of very active debates that were going on about the cost to individuals, versus the benefits to groups, and that the moral complexity was acknowledged and debated openly, right? With the idea that on some level, affirmative action is going to be excluding some people from certain things to advance other people. There is an acknowledgement of individual cost for the greater morality of trying to do this temporary correction to get everybody to an equal starting line. Okay. So what was the goal? Well, the goal was they're trying to fix barriers to access that were based on race and sex and historical exclusion. They were trying to look at a lack of representation in all kinds of places, science, universities, leadership. So that was the idea. And then we move into the 90s. Now, I happened to be at university, from the early 90s through the mid 90s. And so I actually had really a ringside seat for a lot of these things. One of the big things that came online in the 90s was this idea of critical race theory, which emerged out of the legal studies department from Derek Bell and Crenshaw and some other people. And there were a number of things that changed in the 90s that really changed affirmative action and moved it more into diversity, equity, and inclusion as we would know it today. So one of the core ideas was racism wasn't just individual. It was systematic, which we already talked about, but it was always also systemic, which means beliefs, and it was structural, which means it was baked into culture. So the idea is that these sort of structural and systemic beliefs create the concrete conditions like redlining or the denial of credit to women without a men's signature. The idea of intersectionality came online under Crenshaw. And this is the idea that individuals are shaped by overlapping systems of oppression. So bad to be Black, worse to be a Black woman, worse to be a Black gay woman, worse to be a Black disabled gay woman, et cetera, right? So the idea, this intersectionality sort of, the right lampoons it as the what is it, as the oppression Olympics, right? But the idea there, which is, there's obviously some truth in it, right? Like the sort of more places we look at where an individual has cultural hurdles they have to get past, the further they are from that starting line, we could say. Okay. And then here's a big shift, was that when critical race theory was developed, it claimed that the disparities between majority and minority are always explainable by power, and that means things like patriarchy, racism, homophobia, and other problematic internal belief structures and external systems. This is really important. We're going to get into the power piece in a little bit. So in the 90s, DEI begins to broaden. So it goes from this idea to like concrete, right? Skin color, genitalia. And it begins to get into things like gender, which is a more subtle discernment. Just gender is how I identify, independent of my sex. It begins to look at things like bias, belief, unconscious bias, systemic bias, structural racism. In integral language, these are all increasingly subtle objects in the mind, right? They're not things that you can necessarily point to in the world with the five senses and go, well, look at redlining. Look at what they did with the GI Bill. You know, it's clearly racist, right? These are subtler shifts that require more refined capacity to see nuance, to developmental emergence. Okay. So there's a really important part of this. If any one thing underlies the movement from affirmative action to DEI, it would have to do with the idea of implicit bias. Implicit bias. So this came online in the late 90s and blew up by the early 2010s. And Harvard did a study, and it was called the Implicit Association Test, IAT. It's probably still online, I would imagine. I took the test in 2004, 2005, 2006, somewhere in there. And basically what the test does is it shows you like an image of a white face and the word good. And it tests how quickly you react. And then it'll show you like a black face and the word good. And it'll time how quickly you react. And the idea was that the hesitation or the speed you respond, they believed revealed hidden preferences or prejudices. So the faster you pair white and good versus black and good, the test assumes that your implicit bias is showing. So I respond slower to linking black faces with the word good because I'm racist, implicitly, unconsciously. This research was seen as explosive, huge, right? And I remember taking the test, and being like, holy shit, like I have implicit bias. I'm racist. I didn't know that I was walking around with racist beliefs. I don't have any conscious identification or awareness of them. It's really surprising. So, let's see one thing. Okay, so at the time, this was really groundbreaking. It moved the conversation beyond conscious racism and into the realm of unconscious bias. And this sort of offered a measurable psychological tool to examine prejudice that lives under the surface. So it gained huge traction in academia, in HR training, and in the beginning of the first diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. And now we're off. We're off and running. Okay, now we're into the 2000s, we're into the 2005s, moving into the 2010s. So what happens now? What's the next evolution? Well, there's an explosion of DEI offices in universities, government agencies, and corporations. Mission statements around inclusion, representation, belonging, psychological safety, and equitable treatment, they explode. So But there's some subtle things that are happening here, right? The language begins to shift. It's no longer about getting people to an equal starting line. That's affirmative action. Affirmative action says, hey, we live in a meritocracy. Everyone deserves to start at the same place, to not be inhibited by racial barriers that are structural, like redlining, or not allowing people into universities because of their skin color, or not advancing women in science because of their sex, okay? But it goes from these concrete goals to a more subjective experience and subjective harm. So phrases like lived experience is the authority start to be used. So equity gets redefined as equal outcomes, not just equal starting lines. And part of the reason is if lived experience is the authority, and I tell you, hey, I feel oppressed and like I'm being subjected to microaggressions and racism all the time, well, lived experience is the reality. I don't have to run any data on that. I don't have to I don't have to reality test that. I don't have to verify that. It's like, well, then there is systemic racism, there's microaggressions, it's real, it's impacting you, it's holding you back, and we need to fight against it. So systemic bias, right? So this idea, not systematic bias, but systemic bias, this subtle, pervasive racism and sexism, it's assumed to be universally true. And this is a big piece that we'll unpack. So in the 2010s, training programs launch, a little before that really, but you have often mandatory training programs with concepts like unconscious bias, which we just talked about, and microaggressions becoming staples, and of course the idea that lived experience is the authority. Who am I to question your lived experience? DEI becomes an industry. So consultants, certifications, HR mandates, keynote circuits, right? It becomes a business, and it becomes a big business, which is very interesting. And so towards the late 2010s, we have a couple of huge books. White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo comes out in 2018. And Ibrahim X. Kendi, he publishes How to Be an Anti-Racist in 2019, and they sell millions of copies, make both of those people very, very, very wealthy, which is interesting when they talk about privilege and they don't talk about the fact that they are loaded with money, but we'll get to that in a minute. And so we're 2019 now, so the DEI movement is pretty filled out. It's solidly postmodern in its orientation. It's not a rationalist rebuke of racist policies, which is what affirmative action is. It's a postmodern rebuke. It's fueled by thinkers like Foucault and Derrida and these other French deconstructionists that sort of form the underbelly of it. It's informed by critical race theory, which presumes that power is what's really going on under the hood, and all these systemic biases and structural biases are explained and understood by power. So the movement, right, really talks about the subjective experience of harm rather than external data showing actual harm. This becomes a big staple. And here's a really important point. So about this time, a little before, but about this time, remember that Harvard study with the implicit bias, the test that I took, which really proved that I was a racist on an unconscious level, because I had these delayed times between black and good, between white and the word good and a black face and the word good, right? Ergo, I have an implicit bias. Well, a bunch of people start to look at these studies much more carefully, much more scientifically, and they find that implicit bias is unreliable, non-predictive, and can't control for novelty. What does that mean? Well, one of the surprising facts of the implicit bias study was that it showed that black people had a lot of implicit bias. Black people were racist, is what it showed, because they would have the same, some of them would have the same delay in responding that I had, or that other white people had. And so then this idea of, oh, it must be internalized racism, right? They've been so programmed by this racist culture that people of color themselves are racist, and they've internalized this racism in a way that's no wonder things are so bad, right? That's how bad culture is. That's how toxic culture is that it's actually programming black people to work against themselves because they have the same implicit bias that white people have. Well, the problem is that it's unreliable because it's non-predictive. What does that mean? That means, well, when they study people that show big biases according to this movement, and they look at them in the real world, they find that they behave with absolutely no racial bias of any kind. Not how they hire, it's not how they live, it's not how they marry. So there's no corollary between this so-called unconscious bias and their conscious behavior. They're completely, totally unrelated, non-predictive. The second thing they find is that it doesn't control for novelty, and this is a really big one. So if you start putting purple people or orange people or red people into the place instead of black people, what you find is that you have the same delay, the same racism, because novelty produces a delay in the response of association with, say, a white face and a good word, and a non-white face and a good word. And what that means is that if you live in a mostly white culture, when you walk around, you see a lot of white faces, and a black face, brown face, is a bit of a novelty. It's just like, oh, that's different than the last 20 faces I walk by. The novelty response itself can produce the same delay that was presumed to be racist. So in other words, all of the things that the implicit bias study showed could be completely explained away by a novelty response. So black people living in a majority white culture, like Boulder, where I live, they're going to have the same novelty response at seeing a black face that I have, or in seeing a red face or a purple face. I'm not racist against purple people, I assure you. Okay, so this is a really important data piece because really a lot of DEI is built on the back and on the framework of a presumption of implicit bias. Pardon me. Okay. 2020. Anybody remember 2020? What an interesting year 2020 was, huh? So we had COVID, of course. COVID hit us. And we also had George Floyd. Summer of 2020. George Floyd's murder was a catalyst for mass DEI adoption. And it caused a corporate panic. Almost every single Fortune 500 company launched or accelerated their DEI initiatives. There was a language shift. So in the 60s through the 80s, we talked about the idea this was about fairness. In the 2000s, they talked about systemic bias. And after George Floyd, they talk about systemic complicity. Okay. So some common themes begin to emerge in 2020, and this is when I begin to go like, hey, what's going on here? Because I start to see there are some real problems. Common themes. Silence is violence. Now, you don't have to be a philosophy major to understand that silence is violence is another way of saying forced speech or compelled speech. Compelled speech it's not good. It has a very ugly history. Compelled speech is like when you need to talk about how good the government is. No, we love our government. No need for them to come around here and knock on this door because we're good citizens here. That's compelled speech, driven by fear and by an abuse of power. Another common theme, quote, white people are inherently privileged, end quote. And we could put men in there as well. Men are inherently privileged. Another theme is, quote, inclusion requires emotional safety, not just access, end quote. Said another way, it is your responsibility to make sure that I feel safe all the time, not just that I have access to the power structures. Okay, so, and some ugly ironies hypocrisies start to emerge, right? So it's like DEI starts to orient around this idea of speak up in support or stay silent, but silence is violence. So you either support us or sit down and shut up. And if you sit down and shut up, then you're being actually violent. And I love when I would read that back in those days, actual violence. People would say actual violence when they meant metaphorical violence. Because speech isn't actually violent, right? A punch in the face is actually violence. Speech is not actually violent, right? The reason we have speech is so that we don't have to get actually violent. That's the whole reason we have to allow lively debate. It's why the First Amendment here in the States is so important, because we have to say things that other people might disagree with in order to get to the truth, right? I may have to offend the shit out of you for us to figure out where the truth is in these situations, and you may have to do the same to me. And if inclusion requires emotional safety, how do we do that? Well, the answer is we can't. Okay. So another common theme is that disagreement equals white fragility or racism or sexism. So if I disagree with anything here, it's because I'm fragile, white fragility. Or it's because I'm just a racist. So rather than taking arguments on their merit, these ad hominem attacks begin to happen, where that anyone who questions the presumption of this new shift in DEI is automatically, thanks to Robin DiAngelo, right, the white fragility, or you are inherently racist, Ibrahim X. Kendi, because you're not actually fighting racism. You can't just sit around and live your life. If you're not fighting, if you're not actively anti-racist, then you're a racist, right? So you're not doing makes you racist. It's a very, very, very big shift. And again, it's a little bit of an ugly shift, right? Can you see this? Imagine if this was Christianity we were talking about. Imagine if this was Islam we were talking about. Or if it was Trumpism, right? And these same things were, the ugliness of it would be really obvious. How autocratic. Okay, so in 2020 to 2024, the pushback begins, of which I was a part. Right? So cancel culture, right? That starts to step up. The Supreme Court starts revisiting affirmative action. We've got some high-profile firings of people across the board for what they believe, for their beliefs, kind of like McCarthyism. So. And places like Florida and Texas start to legislate against DEI. So things start to move, right? So things were beginning to shake already, right? Before Trump was reelected, DEI was being legislated against, and I think about a dozen, maybe 20 states. It was being dropped quietly by companies. Now it's being dropped loudly. It was being reevaluated by liberal allies like me, and liberal people like me were speaking about it. Right? Again, if you haven't seen me before, I've voted Democratic my whole life. I've been accused of being a Republican. I've been accused of being far right. Kind of funny, but whatever. And now we're in this place where it's being overtly threatened and punished under Trump, which I don't agree with at all. Right? This is two wrongs don't make a right, right? So it's like the Trump administration is using in many ways the same tactics that I find so disagreeable as a liberal to try to shut down these conversations. I don't want to shut down these conversations. I want us to keep having these conversations. I want to hear people who disagree with me, right? That's what this is about. Okay, part 2. So I want to go through the 7 deadly sins of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I gave this talk about 18 months ago. We'll link to it somewhere on this page. So if you want to see a really detailed breakdown of the 7 places where I found DEI to be really problematic, you could go back and watch that talk. It's very long. It's probably an hour and a half, lots of slides, lots of data. So I don't obviously want to give that talk a second time. So I'm just going to go through and give the bullet points. And some of these we've already talked about, but they're worth repeating, and I'm going to bring in some new points as well. Okay, 7 deadly sins of DEI and their fixes. So number 1, the biggest one for me, is a simplistic view of privilege. Is privilege real? Yes, of course privilege is real. But DEI too often flatten privilege into race and sex and gender. Hard stop. You know, they would ignore class, i.e. income. You know, D'Angelo and Kendi and all these other people, they don't get up in front of the stage and say, I want to talk about privilege, and I want to start by talking about the fact that I have $5 million in the bank, and that makes me incredibly privileged. They don't want to do that because it would undermine their moral authority the way that they've been doing it. I always say that anytime I'm in a room and we're talking about privilege, everybody in the room is privileged, almost always, because of the fact that we have the time and the education to be able to talk about it. The main problem with the simplistic view of privilege, there's a lot of things I said about it, but to bottom line it, it ignores money, class, wealth. It ignores a single or 2-parent home, which is one of the single biggest, it is the single greatest predictor of success. You have about a 7% chance of being in poverty as an adult if you have a 2-family home, and you have about a 35% chance of being in poverty as an adult if you're raised in a 1-family home, regardless of race. And education. The single biggest predictor of success is education, regardless of race or sex or gender. So if we're going to talk about privilege, it's not fair to go, the white men are privileged, the white women are privileged, the white people are privileged, right? It's stupid, it's simplistic, and it's not accurate. It's just wrong. You know, Barack Obama's daughters, black women, they're pretty privileged. They're not going to have to worry about money and jobs and safety, right? They got a Secret Service detail for the rest of their lives. Chris Rock's daughters, pretty privileged. Oprah Winfrey, you know, with $1 billion or so in her back pocket, she's pretty privileged, right? So if we're going to talk about it, we got to get honest and talk about the real deal. Number 2, a limited view of diversity. So diversity in the DEI realm only looks at these concrete things, right? And some subtle ones, but race, gender, sex. They don't want diversity of ideas too often. So when they talk about, we need to have a diverse, we need to take our office here at KMS Enterprises and we need more diversity. Well, what they usually mean is we want people who think just like us, but who have different colored skin, different genitalia, or different pronouns. And that's diverse. That's not diverse. Right? Get some log cabin Republicans in there, some gay Republicans. Maybe get some female conservatives, or get some like right of center on the spectrum men, right? Neurodivergence, right? That's another form of diversity. People from the country. If you live in the Bay, the South Bay, you know, the New York City, you know, it's like those, you know, those rural people. Here, those of us that live in the flyover zone, you know, devoutly religious people. So the fix for this limited view of diversity is to include ideological, experiential, and cognitive diversity. That's diversity too. Okay. Number 3, intolerance of dissent. Already talked about this. DEI too often punished heterodoxy. Pretty simple, right? It was that if I disagree with any part of the theory, you're going to label me as being as having white fragility, being a white supremacist. It's intellectually dishonest. It's lazy. It's the same thing that Freud used to do with his critics, where he would say, oh, you don't think everything is about sexual repression? Well, that's because you're sexually repressed. On he would go, right? It's not very intellectually honest. So you fix this intolerance of dissent by stopping purity tests, inviting critique, and don't collapse dissent into racism. Number 4 is an overemphasis on oppression and power, critical race theory. So I spend a lot of time in the other talk on this one. This is actually a really important piece, but I'm going to just tell one story here. I'm going to rein myself in and tell one single story, which is that in the December 2023 Scientific America, which I bought, it had a hunter-gatherer thing on the cover. And Scientific America was really under a very DEI-friendly editor. She just was fired or resigned recently. But there was a lot of criticism about the quote-unquote science that was coming out of quote-unquote Scientific America. And I read this article in Hunter-Gatherers, and there was one sentence that I took note of because I couldn't believe that I read it. And the sentence is this, quote, "The inequality between male and female athletes is a result not of biological differences between the sexes, but of biases of how they are treated in sports," end quote. Okay, well, that statement is wrong. It's just wrong. The 4-minute mile. There are about 1,700 and something men that have run a 4-minute mile since it was first done in whenever it was, the 30s. Do you know how many women have run a 4-minute mile in the last 100 years, 90 years? 0. No women have ever run a 4-minute mile. Is that because of bias, because of systemic racism and patriarchy? No, of course it isn't. It's about biology, right? Men are about 10% faster, stronger, bigger, etc. on average. Those are irreducible, irrefutable, hard biological truths, and you can't just explain them away. And when you do, you end up with statements like that one. The inequality between male and female athletes is a result not of biological differences between the sexes, but of biases of how they are treated in sports. Wrong. Okay, number 5, equality of outcomes. DEI leans into this idea of equality of outcomes over equality of opportunity. And we'll get into this in a little bit because it's a little more philosophically complicated. But equality of opportunities is a very bad idea because it presumes, number 4, it presumes power. Equality of opportunities presumes that the reason there aren't 50% of the CEOs aren't women is because of power differences. It presumes that the reason that 50% of engineers and people in the STEM fields aren't women is because of power and because of sexism. It presumes that right, so you go on, right? So, and the trouble with that presumption is it is a presumption. You have to look at the data set to see where there's choice, where there's biology, and where there might be legitimate oppression, power, old boys clubs, etc. You have to look at things. You have to look at things, okay? Number 6. Number 6 is tribalism over humanism. So the trouble with DEI is that identity becomes the essence of reality. Humanism gets dismissed as naive, or worse, as oppressive and racist, right? Oh my God, you believe in American ideals and you're a humanist? How racist of you. Don't you know that my racial identity is the most important thing and that your beliefs of humanism negate my experience and they make me feel unsafe? And so you're wrong. And we need to send you to a mandatory sensitivity training to prove that. Okay. Number 7, anti-liberal tendencies. Oh, I'm sorry. And the fix over tribalism is obviously to recover complexity. right? Complexity, right? It's okay. There are many identities, right? I'm a human, I'm an American, I'm a man, I'm an integralist, I'm a Zen practitioner, right? All kinds of identities. Okay, and number 7 is anti-liberal tendencies. So we've talked about this: compelled speech, ideological orthodoxy, blacklist culture. And the idea for this, the anti-liberal tendencies, is just to reclaim our liberal values, right? Freedom of thought, presumption of innocence, open discourse, freedom of speech, freedom of ideas, right? These are liberal things. These are good things, good things. It's okay if someone disagrees with you. It's okay, right? So there are 2 more that I want to put in there because I think they're important and that I missed them. And number 8, I would say that we need to tell the truth about the costs to individuals versus the benefits to groups. So if we want to help get everyone to an equal starting line, like we did in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we need to say, look, this is going to cost individuals something. It's going to cost certain segments of the society something to give other people those benefits. There is a moral compromise here. We have to look at the moral complexity and acknowledge that there's a cost to the individual. When you're trying to do equality of outcomes, there is definitely a cost of people. Well, we're going to put in 10 people that have this particular racial or gender profile, no matter what, right? Well, that means you're not going to hire 10 people that don't have that particular dynamic. That means just that there's a cost to an individual. I'm not even opining whether you should or shouldn't do it, but you should tell the truth about the cost. That would get a lot of people to relax. All right. And the final point is you have to define the finish line, right? How do we know we've won? How do we know we've won? If your goal is equity and inclusion, what does that mean? When do you say, hey, everybody, we've made it. We have equity and we have inclusion. Because if you can't define it, your war will never end. Guaranteed. Especially when it's tied to so much subjectivity. Okay, so DEI's biggest problems. This is the 3rd part now. This is the meta-analysis. So stepping up, going out. So you may have seen this. There's been a bunch of meta-studies and peer-reviewed research that have come out in the last 2 to 3 years that have been devastating to some of the claims of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in essence, the meta-analysis shows that DEI programs have either mixed results or negative results when it comes to achieving their goals of equity and inclusion. So a 2022 study, meta-analysis in the Academy of Management, reviewed 40 years of research and found that diversity alone doesn't consistently improve organizational outcomes. In fact, it can increase conflict and reduce cohesion if not partnered with strong leadership and culture. Right? Okay. Another problem these showed was a mix between correlation and causation. So many high-profile DEI studies, they relied on correlational data. And when more controls are added, like around industry size, the country, the effects vanish or they reverse. As we covered earlier, the idea of like bias training and microaggression workshops and mandatory DEI programs, they showed little or no long-term impact at all. And there's quite a bit of evidence that they may actually cause defensiveness and a backlash. So they actually create more of a problem. And then there's a well-known Harvard meta-review recently that found that there's no consistent behavioral change following DEI training interventions. So if you really care about this stuff, you want to look at the fact that what you're doing isn't working. I think that would be a good thing to admit. And why isn't it? Well, for all these things that we've talked about, right? The intention is good. Wanting equity and inclusion is good. Like these are good human capacities. Right? We want to honor the goodness of it. Okay. 4th part. Why keep DEI even if you're skeptical? Okay. So here's why we should keep DEI. Here's why it matters. the first piece is it's about empathy, right? Where does your personal care stop? Do you care about MAGA Republicans? Do you care about Trump? Do you care about trans people? Do you care about trans children? Do you care about the poor? People that have been systematically denied access to things like education? Do you care about gender parity? Racial parity? Do you want people of color to have a harder time in the world than you're having? Or women? Or even white men, if you're one of those two groups? If you are a BIPOC person or you are not cisgendered, do you want your sort of counterparts to suffer more? This is about empathy, folks. This is about giving a shit about other people. DEI matters in the sense because in today's world, we're kind of forgetting to love each other. It sounds a little hokey. But where does your care stop? Who's outside of the box of someone that you give a shit about? And I would encourage you to look real hard at where that is for you. I've made a point, not to get on a soapbox, but I've tried to make it a point and a practice to connect with people that I think I don't like and that I think have stupid or outdated points of views. And I've been surprised and shocked every time I've done it because I've been shown how wrong I am. So that's the first point, is empathy. Second point, repairing historical blind spots beyond the concrete. So some version of repair still matters, right? Even if the frame is flawed. A mature post-DEI program needs to acknowledge privilege in the way that I talked about privileged without becoming ideological and adversarial. It's not about guilt, and it's definitely not about equality of outcome. It's about consciously redressing things and being informed by history and understanding and being able to access complexity and understanding what the finish line means. Why else should we keep DEI? Well, cultural intelligence and global competence. So very simply, DEI can build adaptive capacity if it's grounded in real dialogue. Greater cultural literacy means you can navigate complex situations more effectively. It's sort of 101, right? We're living in a more and more diverse world. The having greater cultural intelligence means that you can compete globally because you have a genuinely diverse staff, genuinely diverse advisors, people with different backgrounds than you, that were raised in different cultures, that have different beliefs, that look different, that act different, that have sex with different kinds of people, or that don't have sex at all, right? Fourth reason would be talent acquisition and representation. So in essence, if you use DEI, you're hiring from a broader pool, which is increasing your reach. It's not increasing your outcomes. We've already shown that that doesn't work. That's what that meta-analysis showed. But you're increasing your reach. So you, in other words, you have a larger range of qualified candidates, and you can possibly uncover overlooked talent. So it's not about ideology, it's about reducing the blind spots and the sourcing of talented people, going to places where maybe you wouldn't normally look to find someone who's a good fit. Fifth reason is real diversity means real anti-fragility. This is probably the most important one. Now, when I say real diversity, I mean diversity. I mean race, gender, ideology, neurobiological, all kinds of diversity, because basically we can when we can access a really diverse group of people, we can meet the challenges the increasing rates of chaos and the increasing complexity that's coming from the world better, because we have more minds that think differently, more points of view, more ways to possibly get at problems and opportunities from a unique place. So you probably don't want a support staff that are all white men that went and got MBAs from the University of Pennsylvania, and you have 12 of them. Chances are that's not going to make you very anti-fragile, because they all think the same. They're all educated in the same way. Maybe they had very similar backgrounds. They're all upper middle class. They're raised upper middle class. That clearly is not going to be a very anti-fragile group of advisors. So diversity helps with anti-fragility so that you can respond and thrive in chaos, right? Okay. Final bit here. So what doesn't belong in diversity, equity, and inclusion any longer? Okay, 4 things. 1, the promise that DEI automatically improves performance. It does not. 2, mandatory one-size-fits-all bias training. That's ineffective and it's harmful. Doesn't work. 3, the push for equality of outcomes. This is developmentally naive, empirically unsupported, unfair, racist, sexist, and it doesn't own any of those things. 4, framing dissent as privileged fragility. This is intellectually dishonest and ethically dangerous. Okay, so that's the end of part 1. And I'm going to take a moment here, have a sip of my coffee. Now, part two is going to be more for the integralists here and for those who are familiar with the terms and models of Ken Wilber, Terry O'Fallon, Bob Keegan, Suzanne Cook-Greuter. And so if you're not familiar with that, it's going to probably not make a lot of sense. And as a reminder, whenever I talk about these adult stages of development, I would encourage everybody to hold them loosely. These are approximations. This is not reality itself. Nobody is at a stage. Nobody is orange or rational, or 3.5 in Terry's model or 4.0 in Keegan's model. Those are all the same thing, orange, 3.5, 4.0, self-authoring, I think Bob calls it now. But no one lives in any one place. Our development is much more like a rainbow in the sense of we're kind of spread across a whole bunch of things. And in any given moment, in any given conversation, we might be coming from 3 different developmental levels depending on what's happening. So hold it loosely. But let's look at DEI from a developmental lens and see if that clarifies anything, okay? So, and we've touched on a lot of this, but affirmative action as a rationalist intervention. That's how we started the conversation. And there's just some things here that are interesting. As I talked about, affirmative action was grounded in a concrete object permanence, a systematic fairness ethic aimed at measurable disparities. The moral focus was fairness. And from the orange point of view, the rationalist point of view, they can see cognitive bias. They know they have cognitive bias. That's why I like double-blind, triple-blind studies, peer-reviewed studies. These come online with the rationalist point of view. But here's the thing. Orange, rationalism, 3.5 in Stages, 4.0 in Keegan, it cannot detect its own cultural biases. It cannot detect its own cultural biases, which means like a pure rationalist, which many of us have encountered, they can't see the limitations of rationality, which is kind of funny from a certain perspective. It's a rules-based and system-oriented, but it's blind to its frame, right? It can't see the frame that it's seeing through. So this means it assumes that the rule, like fairness equals equality of opportunity, they believe that that is inherently unbiased. And at the next developmental level, green or postmodernism, they point out correctly that it is inherently, potentially biased, that the idea of equality of opportunity is inherently unbiased is not correct. Pretty easily provable is not correct. Okay, so here's a really important part for the rationalism for orange. It can project itself into others' shoes, but it can't see that others can do the same to them. So a great orange statement is you have to walk a mile in another man's shoes. So there's a recognition that, oh, I can put myself in someone else's experience, but I have to kind of work at it. But what they don't see is that someone can do that to them. And how do I know that? How do I make that leap? Well, that's when someone at this developmental level says something like, I don't see race, I don't see color. Why are they saying that? Because when they look out, that's true for them. But they can't see that someone looking back at them that projects themselves into their shoes would say like, hey, Keith, it's great you don't see race, but I'm black. And so I have to see race every day. If you actually walk in my shoes, really walk in my shoes, you'll see that the world that I live in is different than the world you live in. And I have to encounter the legacy of racism in a way that you don't have to. Okay, so beyond this, we have orange can easily discern facts versus interpretations, but in an either or fashion, not a both and fashion. That's postmodern. Orange rationalists believe that progress is real because we look at the concrete results. And the final piece is they can't see that fairness and merit are culturally embedded, that their ideas are culturally embedded. Now, that doesn't mean they're wrong, which is kind of what the DEI movement would say. It just means that they're culturally embedded. It means that they're not Platonic ideals. Okay, so DEI. DEI comes out of the green worldview, comes out of the postmodern worldview. 4.0 in Terry's model, basically 4.5 in Bob Keegan's model. Okay, so pluralist. So here you can see that cognitive bias is real, just like the rationalists can see it's real, but you can see that that cognitive bias can be projected outward by many, many people onto groups of people. So in essence, there can be cultural cognitive bias, if you will. Said another way, they can see that metacognition, when they think about thinking, the way rationalists can think about thinking, they can see another layer of reality. They can see that metacognition can be bound in biases, bound in cultures. It can be bound in unconscious projections, that it's embedded in groups, and that it's subservient to the unconscious biases of those groups. What that means is things like you get a group of male scientists together in 1975, and they are rationalists. They are coming from that 4.0 in Keegan's model point of view. And they actually can't really see that they have a boys' network of sexism where they really actually don't believe that women can really do science. That frame is sort of unconscious to them. That's what green or postmodernism can begin to see. The idea that the metacognition that's embedded in cultures and groups is subservient to the unconscious biases of those groups. There's truth in that, right? That's an insight. This postmodern point of view tends to think that progress isn't real because it believes in how people feel. And if people don't feel like there's progress, then there is no progress. So identity is no longer a concrete object, but it's constructed, fluid, and about overlapping experience. Emotional and subtle discriminations, microaggressions, tone, perceived safety, all these things become critical. There's a presumed racism and power dynamic in microaggressions as opposed to cultural ignorance. So this gets back to critical race theory. So if I'm out and about in Boulder and I'm walking around and I see a 6'9" black guy who's 22 years old and I start talking to him about basketball, the postmodern point of view is going to say that is a microaggression because I presumed he was a basketball player and not a scientist or a philosopher or an engineer. And that the reason I did that is because I have an unconscious bias, that I'm actually an unconscious racist, right? The trouble here is that it doesn't see that it could just be cultural ignorance, not just racism. I might say that because I don't have many black friends. I have a good buddy that when he moved from Kentucky to just south of Philadelphia, people asked him all the time if he owned a horse, if he lived on a farm, all these microaggressions that weren't microaggressions. They were just culturally ignorant because they didn't know Southerners, right? They had no reference point for Southerners. Okay, so another thing about the green point of view, the postmodern point of view, is that inclusion and subjective experience arise here. So inclusion and subjective experience arise, and policies are crafted around how people feel. The trouble with this is it confuses interiority with universality. So if I feel excluded, then you've excluded me, even if it isn't true. So this worldview sees systems of oppression everywhere, but it lacks a meta view that includes its own interpretive frame. Said another way is that it uses emotion and inner subjectivity as epistemology, standpoint truth. But it can't observe the biases in its interpretive lenses. Okay, so a belief structure from here would be some version of my beliefs are context dependent, and those contexts are more important than individual reasoning. That's something that someone here might say. My beliefs are context dependent, and those contexts are more important than any individual reasoning because I don't trust individuals, because individuals are biased, groups are biased, systems are biased. So bias and context are more important than science and reason from this worldview. And of course, the green worldview has trouble seeing paradox, which we've talked a lot about here, hypocrisy. Right? It's riddled with hypocrisy, but it's not necessarily hypocritical from within its own worldview. Just like when a fundamentalist Christian tells you that you're going to go to hell forever and be punished forever because you don't believe what they believe, and you go, that doesn't sound very like a very loving and kind God. They don't see the hypocrisy inside of that worldview. It's not visible to them. Okay, so a big part of DEI is that it isn't just green or postmodern. It's also driven and enforced by early rationality, or what Terry O'Fallon calls the expert phase. So in integral language, this would be umber, or coming out of a conformist thinking, going into early rationality, but you're not yet at mature rationality, like where affirmative action came from. So in my personal opinion, most of the culture wars that we currently see are driven by this expert phase. So expert phase, they love rules and metrics. They love training, bias training hours, racial equality audits, hiring statistics. They can't see their interpretive bias that's baked into their worldview. They have a lot of subtle absolutisms, like all disparities are discrimination. The expert loves critical race theory because it just sees that everything is about power. It can't look at the data objectively the way rationalists could and go, oh, well, that example Keith just gave about the 4-minute mile, an expert would say they would find a way to prove that that was somehow wrong. So there's a ton of cognitive bias that they can't see. The expert phase believes that the frame is the reality. They can't differentiate. So in other words, if I critique DEI, I critique them. When equality fails to produce outcomes, the expert doesn't question the frame. They intensify enforcement. Think of the DEI scorecard, right? Ensuring racial parity, no matter what, equality of outcomes. 50% of CEOs must be female because unless that's true, it has to be oppression. It can't be choice. Right? There's so much complexity is lost here. When disparities persist, or when perceived disparities persist, like the fact that 25 years ago, 20% of people in the STEM fields were women, and today, 20% of the people in the STEM fields are women. Despite everything, all the ink that's been spilled, all of the grants, all of the promotions, all of the mentorships, right? It's like, it's still there. And I would argue well, that's probably because 20% of the people that go into STEM fields are women, and ergo 20% of the people that work in STEM are women. there might not be anything going on here. That's why you can't correct the problem. But from an expert phase, they would say, well, the disparity persists. That means the system is resisting. And so we mandate more trainings. We add new policies. We begin to force equality of outcomes. Because the system is so stubborn, we have to force it to comply. The expert never asks if their concept of equity is flawed. They only ask if it's been fully enforced. And then finally, the expert, like all of us, me included, the world is made of systems, but they can't see the interior assumptions that are guiding those systems. Okay, so here we are, folks. We're near the end. Thank you. Hanging in here for an hour. I realize it's probably been a little bit information dense. But this critique, this view that I'm offering, this is a construct aware in Terry's model, 4.5, in Bob's model, 5.0, Thiel and integral, right? From this point of view, we know that we've built this house on sand. So here, cognition is meta-systemic. Every policy, every truth claim, they're all held within interpretive frames. DEI is a postmodern worldview, which is deeply embedded in postmodern identity logic, but it doesn't have the developmental capacity to see itself. DEI claims to be liberatory, but it functions as a normative, coercive ideology that pushes values while denying they are values. Right? It's many of the paradoxes and hypocrisies. I'm stating my values, right? I stated my values throughout this: liberalism, freedom of speech, freedom of ideas, open debate, having hard conversations to come to the truth, being willing to offend someone in service of the truth. These are all values that I'm expressing, right? Putting them on the table, making them conscious, making them something that can be talked about, because those values are informing this talk. That's part of a Thiel critique, right? You're able to own what's driving the very thing that you're criticizing and why you are. So, this idea of equality of outcomes, it's an abstraction from this point of view. It's a utopian vision, but it's not aligned with complex systems realities, right? It's not as simple as 50% of women should be CEOs. It's just not that simple. And again, I get into this in the other talk if you're interested in a deeper dive as to why that is. And then finally, DEI is epistemologically naive. It treats feelings as facts. It treats systems as conscious agents, right? But systems can have racist elements in them, but they can't be racist themselves because they're not individuals. So liberation in a DEI world, from this point of view, requires that we transcend the frame, not reinforce it on the one hand, and not throw it away on the other. Okay, so my final bit. I want to give 9 places where DEI can work. And if these were implemented, I've already talked about the reasons why I think DEI matters. Here are 9 things that could happen that would make it work. Number 1, get real about privilege. Number 2, allow real diversity. Number 3, allow and encourage dissenting opinions. Number 4, see the powerful limitations of critical race theory. You have to look at data, you have to look at biology, you have to look at choice. Can't fix a problem that isn't a problem. Drop equality of outcomes out together. That comes from an expert point of view. Encourage humanism, not tribalism. Now, personal identity matters, racial identity matters, economic identity matters, class identity matters, right? But we want to encourage humanism above all those things. That's not inherently racist, classist, sexist, whatever. Number 7 is reclaim liberal values. Freedom of thought, presumption of innocence, open discourse, freedom of speech, freedom of ideas. Number 8, tell the truth about the costs. So this is the idea of the cost to the individual versus the benefit to the group. It's like vaccines, right? There's some cost to individuals. Some people get hurt by vaccines, very few, but there is some individual cost that benefits the group. You just have to tell the truth, right? Finally, number 9, define a finish line. How do we define success? How do we know when we've reached equity? All right, folks. That's what I got. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to call in or to send me a chat. Be happy to answer it. All right. Looks like no questions, no comments. All right, folks. Well, it was an interesting talk. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you find you have a question, feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, I will see you in 2 weeks. And thanks to Corey and Rob Smith over at Integral Life for hosting this. Again, if you would like to know more about me, feel free to visit keithmartinsmith.com. All right. Thanks, everybody.